Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film my 2018 reading stats video. So if you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know that I am a stats nerd. I love a good spreadsheet and I love to keep track of my reading over the year to then at the end of the year compile a whole bunch of statistics to tell me in various categories how I did with my reading. So I am going to turn the camera around so that you can look at my computer, and we'll talk over how I do with my reading this year. The first statistic that I tracked is what genre or which class of style of writing I read. So the biggest chunk of which is obviously nonfiction at 39% of my total reading. Then we get the breakdown. The rest of this pie is fiction, which this orange piece at almost 20% is general fiction. So anything that is contemporary or literary fiction would fall into this category. We then have 10% fantasy, 6% graphic novel, 6% classics, and then a more even breakdown of a bunch of different genres: sci-fi, mystery, romance, horror, suspense, short stories, a little bit of historical fiction, poetry, and one Western. So you can see that I read across basically every type of genre, but I clearly love nonfiction above all else, which I don't think comes at any surprise to any of you watching. The next thing I looked at was how I rated the books. Now, I don't generally assign a star rating on Goodreads, but in my book journal, I do mark ratings between 1 and 5 and using the half, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and so on and so forth. So these are the 1 ratings all the way up to the 5 ratings over here. So it's good that most of my reading is heavily weighted between the basically 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5 star rating. So very little of my reading is actually these lower numbers, which is good. It means I'm doing a good job of picking out books that I would love. I had 3 books that I rated 1 star, no books that I rated 1.5 star, 5 books that I rated 2, and then 6 books 2.5. And then I consider everything basically 3 and up to be a good read. 3 is basically an average read for me. 5 is a stellar read that I expect to reread at some point in the future. The next thing I track is the source of my books. So whether they belong to me, I've gotten them out of the library, or I borrowed them from a friend or a family member. Clearly, the blue chunk of this pie graph is my books that I own. So that's the majority of the books that I read are books that I own. 106 of the books that I read. And I don't know that I ever mentioned that at the beginning of this video that I overall read 151 books this year. So 106 of those were books that I owned, 42 were books that I borrowed, and then 42 were books that I got from the library, and then 3 were ones that I borrowed. So I did a good job of reading books that I owned, but as we'll talk about in a minute, this includes all kinds of books and not just books that I physically have in my possession. So then on to the type of book. The 4 types of books that I track are hardcover, paperback, ebook, or audiobook. Paperback is the biggest majority of books that I read, but not by much. This is 36% of the total, and then everything else breaks down pretty evenly except for ebooks, which are the least favored format that I'm reading in these days, and that's at 14%. So you can see that when I look at the source, which is whether I owned a book or not, this great big chunk of 70% of the books that I read were books that I owned. This whole chunk includes physical books that I own, audio books that I own, and ebooks that I own. And that will become more important in my next video where I talk about my reading plans for 2019, because that is a situation that's developing that I'm not entirely comfortable with. But I am comfortable with the fact that I read across all types of formats. I think that's a good, diverse reading style to read through every variety of format that's available to me. I also track diversity in the books that I read, and I've talked about this before on my channel. When I say diversity, I mean that the characters in the book or the topic in the book is a situation that's beyond my personal experience. So it either means that the author or the characters are a different race or a different religion, or a different sexuality than I am, or it's a different country than I live in, like if it's a country in Africa or a country in Asia. Those are very different from the lifestyle that I have in the West, in the United States. So diversity is basically means to me any author or characters in a book or situation in a book that is very different from my current status or where I live or any of the characteristics that define me as a person. So I am extremely happy about my reading when it comes to diversity, because I've really increased the amount of books that I read that have either are diverse in terms of their author or their content. 52% of my reading was what I consider to be diverse this year. And that's up from last year, where I think I was around 30 or 35% last year. So that, I think, is really great. I've almost basically achieved parity in that almost half of the books I read are about people or places different from myself, versus half that are, white, American or English speaking places and people. So I think that's really great. I'd love to continue basically this breakdown in my reading going forward, and I think I will, because I think the way that I read, I try to be reading something different with every book that I pick up, so that I don't fall into a rut and read the same stories over and over again. And then the last thing I track is author gender, and this is just sort of for my own personal benefit, just to see. And you can see that I clearly read far more female authors than I do male authors, and this little sliver is for books that have both male and female authors. So that's pretty clear, and I think that's not surprising to anybody that watches this channel and looks at the kind of books that I read, that I would naturally gravitate towards female authors. I'm not on purpose picking books that I read based on author gender. This is just the way it falls out. So this is just the way that I am most comfortable and interested, I guess, in my reading. And I don't have any plans to change this. I'm happy with this breakdown of 66% female authors to 33% male authors. I don't have any problem with that. So that's my breakdown of my reading for 2018. I'm really excited with reading 151 books total this year. That's high for me. I think last year I was around 130 books read for the year, and 130 is more my typical average. But clearly, BookTube is having a positive impact on my reading life and encouraging me to pick up books even more often than I have in the past. The other thing that's happened is I only have one child living at home nowadays, so that definitely frees up my time in terms of allowing more time for reading. And also with my job, I am able to listen to audiobooks when I drive, and I do a lot of driving for my work. So I'm pretty happy with how my 2018 reading went, and I will be back soon with another video to talk about my plans for 2019. Talk to you later.